So before I start, I guess one of the things I'm thinking about is how difficult it is to follow Patrick. I wish I was kind of either before or further in the schedule, but anyway, I'll do my best. So I think, a lot of the things that have been talked about this morning echo our experience with PPI, and our goal really is to ensure that medical devices that we develop have a real and tangible impact on patient care. And so one of the challenges that we face is that, and I think Andrew might have touched on it earlier, is about 5% of medical research ever makes that translation to the clinic. So that's a real problem. And one of the reasons why that happens is that, medical research is akin to normal research, but with many more ways to fail. So it can fail on technology, but can also fail through a badly designed clinical study, or clinicians not adopting the technology, or patients not adopting the technology. And so essentially what we try and do in our research is to do a lot of due diligence before we start a project to ensure that if we start it, we're able to bring it all the way through the translational pathway. And so this slide is a slide we've been presenting for about 7 years, and it talks about the things that we investigate before we start a medical device project. So trying to map out why projects fail and to do research on that at the very start. So we will talk to investors, we will talk to insurers who pay for medical devices, we will talk to distributors who sell medical devices, all before the project starts. And one of those slides is stakeholders. So we talk to people who can influence whether a device will be adopted. So that is patients, insurers, reimbursers. So in the US, medical devices are reimbursed by insurers or the state. And so we talk to them saying, if we develop this technology, would you pay for it? And we weight the feedback we get from all of these people based on how they influence whether a technology will be adopted. And interestingly, how the weight of the different voices is changing all the time. So this question about whose voice drives adoption, so who makes the choice about which technology makes it to the clinic. And so maybe up until maybe 10 to 15 years ago, the primary voice in that decision was the clinician. And we would always say the key opinion leader clinician. So this is the clinician from the Mayo Clinic who's the world expert on this technology or on this clinical area. And they will say this technology is the best way to treat, and that becomes the accepted wisdom. Insurers start to pay for it, and it gets to the market. So more recently, that voice has been diluted by part of the decision being made by hospital procurement. So now hospital procurement is a panel who not only take the advice of the clinician, but will also look for the value for money decision. So if we have a certain budget in the hospital and we could decide to buy one of 3 devices, which one will give the best value for money, the best quality of life improvement for the patient? So now it's a more complex adoption process. And more recently, we're seeing that the patient voice is becoming more important. And I think, as Andrew mentioned, patient groups are much more empowered now. People are much more informed, so they want to be heard in this choice of which technologies get adopted. There's also an interesting thing happening in medtech, and I don't know if this is a commercial or a strategic decision, but companies are now looking at selling directly to patients. And the advantage of that is, you see it in certain sectors, is that you bypass insurers, you bypass clinicians, and if there are home-based medical devices, these companies can sell directly to the patient. So this is why I think the patient voice is becoming more important, and companies are more aware of it. So each year within our research program, we look at various different clinical areas, and we look for opportunities for new medical devices in an area. And if you do that for a number of years, you start to notice patterns. So one year we will pick cardiac devices. And if you look at devices for cardiac care, you realize this is a really crowded space. There's loads of solutions in here. About 2 or 3 years ago, we started looking at women's health. And we found the opposite. So there are areas of medicine that are totally underserved in terms of medical devices. And for me, that's really interesting. Why is that the case? Why is there clinical conditions in women's health that are really underserved with the same incidence, the same prevalence of the disease, but there aren't good solutions out there? So this is where I think PPI could have real impact. So when we looked at women's health, we found that there's a huge number of clinical needs that aren't addressed by medical devices. One example, which I think is really interesting, is breast pumps. So breast pumps have been on the market for about 20 years or 30 years, and there's lots of different devices on the market. But about 5 years ago, a company in the States decided that they would go out and ask women what they wanted in a breast pump and prioritize what features that they wanted. And so they come up with this Willow device. And why this device is selling is that women said, for us, it's not comfort that's the first priority. It's not time. It's not efficiency. It's how discreet the device is and whether we can use this at work or in the office. And so this has completely disrupted the market by just going out and talking to women and saying, what is actually important to you, the end user, not what we think is important to you as engineers or scientists. Another area that we're working in now is endometriosis, which is, when we started looking at women's health, 1 in 10 women suffer from this disease. And if that was in cardiac care, where 1 in 10 men or 1 in 10 of the population suffered from it, there would be lots of solutions and lots of research being developed. But this is almost like a hidden disease. There are very poor solutions out there. There are very few options. And, that's I'm not sure what the reason behind that is, but we saw a lot of this in women's health and also in early childcare health. There are not good devices, not good solutions in that space. We also see it in areas of disease management. And I'd have my own theories about why this is the case, but patients with chronic pain are not served well by devices. 2 areas that we're looking at is, so chronic pain is one, and I think part of that reason is that these patients are often told that they'll have to live with the chronic pain, so we can treat the disease or the condition, but we kind of have to manage the chronic pain, so they're left to live with it. But that's really important to the patients. So it's really important to the patients, but may not necessarily be the first thing that the clinician will think of. One area we're working in is chemotherapy-induced hair loss. Again, very important to the patient, but the clinician is worrying about treating the cancer. Lymphedema, which is swelling of the limbs post-treatment of cancer. Again, this is something that the patients will deal with for life post-cancer surgery. And it has a huge impact on quality of life. It has a huge impact on the patient, but often it's seen as a side effect of treatment. So these kind of side effects or disease management, long-term disease management, I think are underserved by devices. And it's really important that through PPI we get an insight into these problems, which we wouldn't necessarily get if we talk to the clinician directly. And I'm trying to figure out why are certain areas underserved, and it may be just because these are lesser heard voices. So we don't hear the voice of the patient who has lymphedema because their cancer has been cured, but they're dealing with the side effect. We don't really hear the voice of someone has lost their hair through chemotherapy because the cancer might be cured. So this is a project that we're working on, which is called the Illuminate project, which is a technology to end chemotherapy-induced alopecia. And this is a really interesting problem, and it has raised a lot of PPI type questions for us. But when you look at some of the statistics, 47% of women say one of the most traumatic aspects of cancer treatment is hair loss. And 8% of patients will refuse chemotherapy because they want to avoid hair loss. So this is a real problem. And so we worked with Adele to engage with patients and to understand how real this problem is, whether there was appetite for change, how existing solutions worked or didn't work, and that has shaped our solution. So from before this project started, before we sought even funding for the project, we went and talked to these patients. And interestingly, we're currently trying to fund this project, and the feedback we got from reviewers when we tried to fund it was, one, is this a real problem at all? And two, your device itself could introduce a certain amount of pain to the patient. Would they be able to take the pain associated with your device? And so both of those questions, the answer to both of those questions came through PPI. So the question about was it a real problem? Absolutely, it's a real problem. And two, would patients tolerate pain from your device if it prevented hair loss? And they almost laughed at that question because they said, we're undergoing so many procedures as it is. This is really important. We would tolerate your device if it meant that we could retain hair and we wouldn't have this problem of hair loss. So we're currently developing the solution, but how the solution is formed and how it's going to be delivered is really been shaped by the PPI process. Sorry, this is skipping on. A second example of where we've engaged with PPI is a chronic pain project. So over 357,000 people in Ireland suffer from neuropathic pain or chronic pain. And one of the things that we wanted to look at was to talk to patients and, again, before the project started, to understand the problem and understand what we would need to do to address it. We also wanted to understand how they were currently being treated and where the gaps were. And so we talked to, through PPI, we talked to patients. We also talked through groups in Arthritis Ireland and also MS Ireland. And so Alison, who's the project lead, joined a walking group with MS Ireland and went on walks with them to understand what it was like to be a patient who was dealing with chronic pain. So I think Nikita mentioned this idea of what effect does PPI have on researchers. So we're shaping our solution based on the feedback we're getting from patients, but probably more importantly, like how desperate these patients are for solutions is changing our view of this project. So we work in various different clinical areas, every year in a new clinical area. I've never got personal phone calls from patients desperate for a solution, but we get it for chronic pain. So I would get 3 phone calls a week from patients saying, I've read about this study, when is the solution being developed, how do I get involved? So there's a huge need for PPI, even just for us to understand how the scale of the problem. So this is what we're doing. We are at the very start of projects, allowing the project to be formed based on feedback from patients. And it's having those 2 effects. 1, it shapes the project, and 2, it helps us understand the need and the urgency for developing these type of technologies. So that's really where we are. We have a number of other projects, but I think these 2 are representative because one is about shaping the solution. The other one is making us understand the scale of the problem. But I'm happy to take questions about either. So that's where we are.